The morning George Townsend finally rode down from the mountains. The sky above Copper Ridge, Colorado, looked like the inside of a bruised plum, all purple and deep red at the edges, and the single thought that had pulled him out of 7 years of solitude sat like a stone in the center of his chest. He had not planned to come back. He had told himself that every single season, every winter when the snow packed itself 6 feet deep against his cabin walls, every spring when the elk came back to the high meadows, and he had no reason to go anywhere but further up into the pines. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, bearded to the collarbone, and he had made his peace with the world up on that mountain. Or so he had told himself for 7 long years. But peace has a way of breaking apart the moment you hear something you cannot unhear. It had been old Silas Gentry who told him. Silas was one of the few people who ever made the trek up the Switchback Trail to trade with George, coming twice a year to exchange salt, flour, and the occasional bottle of whiskey for the beaver pelts and elk hides George had spent months curing. Silas was 63 and had the disposition of a man who had seen everything twice and found it all disappointing the second time. He was not given to gossip, which was exactly why George had listened when Silas set down his pack in the doorway of the cabin and said, without any kind of preamble, "Maria Dawson is in trouble." George had not reacted visibly. He had kept his hands busy wrapping the last of a bundle of pelts, kept his eyes down on his work, but every muscle in his body had gone tight as a bowstring. "What kind of trouble?" he said. "The kind a woman gets into when her husband dies and leaves her holding a debt she never knew about," Silas said, settling himself into the one chair George kept beside the cold fireplace. "Bank in Copper Ridge is looking to take her land. She's got that little farm just east of town, the one she built with Daniel Dawson before he passed last spring. They had 2 daughters together, both under 10. She's been fighting it on her own." George had said nothing for a long time. He kept wrapping the pelts. Outside, the wind came down off the peak and rattled the shutters. "Why are you telling me?" he finally said. Silas looked at him with those pale, worn-out eyes and said, "Because 7 years ago you left that town on account of something that happened, and I always thought it was a damn fool decision. And because Maria Dawson never did anything to deserve what she's got coming to her." That had been 4 days ago. George had spent those 4 days talking himself out of going, and then talking himself back into it, and then standing at the door of his cabin at 3 in the morning looking at the stars and understanding with a clarity he did not entirely welcome that he was going to ride down into Copper Ridge whether his pride agreed with it or not. Because the truth was, and George had buried it deep enough that he almost believed it was gone, but the truth was that Maria had been the reason he left in the first place. Not because she had wronged him, not because of anything ugly, but because 7 years ago, when they were both 25 and Daniel Dawson had just asked her to marry him, George had stood in the back of the Copper Ridge General Store and realized with the force of a physical blow that he was in love with a woman who was about to become someone else's wife. And rather than stay and watch it happen, rather than smile through Sunday dinners and pretend that everything was fine, he had packed his horse and ridden up into the mountains and told himself the elevation would eventually cure him of it. It had not. He crossed the last ridge as the sun was climbing to mid-morning, and the valley spread out below him, familiar and strange all at once. Copper Ridge had grown since he left. There were more buildings along the main street, a new church steeple rising white against the brown hills, and what looked like a proper schoolhouse on the north end of town. The population had been about 400 people when George left. By the look of it now, in the year 1878, it was closer to 700. He rode in slowly, because his horse Hester had not been on a main street in years, and needed a moment to settle herself in the noise and smell of other horses and wagon wheels and people. George himself needed a moment for the same reason, though he kept that thought private. The looks he got were considerable. He was aware of how he appeared, the long coat, the beard, the packs of pelts on the horse behind him, and he was aware that children were stopping on the boardwalk to stare. One old man outside the barber shop squinted at him for a long time before his face shifted into recognition. "George Townsend," the old man said. "Well, I'll be damned." "Hello, Mr. Ellis," George said. He tied Hester to the post outside the general store and went inside, because he needed to sell his pelts and get some information before he did anything else, and because walking straight to Maria's farm without any kind of preparation felt like the sort of reckless thing that would go wrong in every possible direction. The man behind the counter of the general store was not the same man who had run it 7 years ago. This one was younger, maybe 35, with a thick red mustache and a way of looking at people that suggested he was constantly trying to figure out how to get the better of them in a negotiation. His name, George learned from the conversation that followed, was Frank Hurley, and he had bought the store from old Pete Calloway 2 years back. George sold his pelts for a fair price because he was patient enough to wait out Hurley's first 3 lowball offers, and then he said, "I'm looking for information on a land dispute. Maria Dawson, farm east of town. Who's handling the claim against her?" Hurley's expression shifted slightly, the way a man's expression shifts when a topic comes up that he's already thought about from several angles. "Bank of Copper Ridge," he said. "Lester Kane runs it. He says Daniel Dawson had a loan out against the farm, $1,500. Daniel died without paying it back, and Kane says the debt transfers to the property." "Does it?" George said. "Well," Hurley said, leaning on his counter, "that's the question, isn't it? Maria's been saying the loan document isn't legitimate, says Daniel never signed it, but Kane's got a paper with Daniel's signature on it, and the circuit judge is due through here in about 3 weeks. George absorbed this. "Where does Maria stand?" "She's got no lawyer. There's no lawyer in Copper Ridge. Nearest one's in Pueblo, and she can't afford to bring one out." Hurley paused, then added, almost against his will, "She's a good woman. Better than most. Everybody knows it, but knowing it doesn't stop a judge from reading a piece of paper." George bought flour, salt, and a bar of soap, because he was aware that he smelled like 7 years of mountain living, and that was not how he wanted to appear when he saw Maria Dawson again. He took a room at the boarding house on the corner of Main and Elm, paid for 3 nights, and spent a considerable amount of time at the wash basin before he felt like a human being again, rather than a bear that had recently learned to walk upright. He also borrowed a razor from the boarding house proprietress, a stout woman named Mrs. Helen Crow, who handed it over with a look that suggested she approved of his decision to use it. He trimmed the beard rather than removing it entirely, because he was not the same man who had left this town at 25, and it seemed dishonest to pretend otherwise. But he looked at himself in the small cracked mirror above the washstand and recognized himself well enough. Still the same gray eyes, still the same jaw, a few more lines around the eyes, a few more threads of silver in the dark hair at his temples, but 32 years old was not ancient, not even in a world that had a way of aging men quickly. He went to see Maria that same afternoon. Her farm was exactly where Silas had described it, about a mile east of town, along a dirt road that ran parallel to the creek. It was a modest place, a white frame house with a covered porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the south, a kitchen garden that was clearly being tended with care because the rows were straight and the weeds had been kept down. There were chickens in the yard and a milk cow in the small pasture beside the barn. A rope swing hung from the big cottonwood tree near the porch. George sat on Hester at the gate for a moment, looking at it all, and tried to identify what he was feeling. He settled on something between determination and terror, which seemed about right. He dismounted and led Hester through the gate when the door of the house opened. She came out onto the porch drying her hands on her apron, and she stopped when she saw him, and George stopped too, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Maria Dawson was 32 years old. She had dark hair that she wore pinned up, with strands of it escaping to curl around her face the way they always had. She was not tall, but she carried herself with the kind of uprightness that made a person seem larger than their height. Her eyes were the dark brown of creek water over smooth stones, and they were fixed on George with an expression that moved through several things very quickly: surprise, confusion, something that might have been relief, and then immediately doubted itself. "George Townsend," she said. Her voice was the same, lower than most women's voices, steady, with that particular quality of a person who has learned to keep their feelings from running away in their words. "Maria," he said. And then, because he felt like he owed her more than just her name used as a greeting, "I heard you were having some difficulties. I thought I might be of some help." She studied him for a long moment from the porch. "You have been on that mountain for 7 years," she said. "Yes." "And you came down now?" "Yes." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Come up and sit down. I'll put coffee on." He tied Hester to the porch post and came up the steps, and the porch boards creaked under his boots just the way porch boards are supposed to creak, and he sat in the chair she gestured toward while she went inside to start the coffee. 2 small girls appeared in the doorway, examining him with the frank curiosity of children who have not yet learned to pretend they are not staring. The older one was perhaps 9, with her mother's dark hair. The younger one was maybe 6, and she had Daniel Dawson's lighter coloring, which George recognized from memory. "I'm Lucy," the older girl said. "Who are you?" "George Townsend," he said. "I used to live in town a long time ago." "You look like you live in the woods," Lucy said, not unkindly, just as an observation. "I do live in the woods," he said, "up on the mountain." The younger girl, who he would later learn was named Clara, considered this information with great seriousness. "Do you have a bear?" she asked. "Not a pet one," he said, "but there are bears nearby." This appeared to be satisfactory, because both girls disappeared back inside, apparently to report this intelligence to their mother. Maria came back out with 2 tin cups of coffee and set one down on the small table beside his chair before taking her own chair across from him. She sat with her hands folded around her cup, and she looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you know," she said. "Lester Kane at the bank is claiming a $1,500 debt against the farm. Says Daniel signed a loan." "You say Daniel didn't. The circuit judge comes through in 3 weeks. Who told you all of that?" she asked. "Silas Gentry told me you were in trouble. Frank Hurley at the general store told me the details." "Silas Gentry," she said, and something crossed her face that might have been fond exasperation. "That old man. I told him I didn't need people making a fuss." "He didn't make a fuss," George said. "He told me the facts and left it to me to decide what to do about them." Maria looked down at her coffee cup. When she looked up again, there was something direct in her gaze that reminded George of everything he had ever liked about her. Maria Dawson had never been a person who talked around the edges of things when she could talk about the center of them. "Why did you come, George?" she said. "The real reason. Not just because Silas told you there was trouble. There is trouble all over Colorado. You could have stayed on your mountain." He held her gaze. "Because it was your trouble," he said, "and because I should have stayed in this town 7 years ago instead of running off, and I think somewhere in the back of my head I've known that for a long time." She was quiet for a moment. "You left when Daniel and I announced our engagement," she said. "Yes. I always wondered about that." He did not say anything to that, and she did not press it, at least not then. Instead, she set her coffee cup down and said, "The loan document is a forgery. Daniel was not a man who kept secrets from me, and he would not have taken out a debt that large without telling me. More than that, I know his handwriting. Whatever is on that paper, it is not his signature. I know it like I know my own." "Has anyone else seen the document?" "Lester Kane showed it to the sheriff, who is a man named Roy Pickett. Pickett says it looks legitimate to him." "But Roy Pickett and Lester Kane have dinner together every Thursday, which tells you something about Roy Pickett's impartiality." George felt his jaw tighten slightly. Small towns had a way of letting power concentrate in the wrong hands when nobody was paying attention. "Do you have anything of Daniel's with his actual signature on it? Letters, documents, anything official. Maria stood up and went inside without a word and came back 2 minutes later with a wooden box. She set it on the table between them and opened it. Inside were letters, receipts, a marriage certificate, a deed to the property. She spread them out carefully and said, "Everything here is in his hand." George leaned forward and looked. He was not a lawyer and he knew it, but he had spent enough time alone with nothing but books and his own mind that he had a certain analytical precision when he turned it on a problem. He looked at the marriage certificate first, then the deed, memorizing the shapes of the letters, the particular way Daniel Dawson had formed his D's and his capital letters. "Can you get me a look at the document Kane has?" he said. "He's not exactly going to invite us in for a viewing," Maria said. "People can be persuaded," George said, "especially when they're not sure who they're dealing with." She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "You are different than I remember," she said. 7 years on a mountain will do that," he said. "Different is not a bad thing," she said quietly, and then picked up her coffee cup again as if she had not just said something that George could feel all the way down through his chest. He spent the rest of that afternoon at the farm, because Lucy and Clara kept finding reasons to come out to the porch and inspect him, and he found he did not mind their company. Lucy was sharp and asked pointed questions about mountain life, with the enthusiasm of someone who was already composing the story she would tell her friends. Clara was quieter, and she eventually climbed into the chair next to George's and sat there looking at the yard with a companionable silence that reminded him, unexpectedly and painfully, of how much he had missed having human company. Maria came back out after she had started something on the stove for supper, and she sat across from him, and they talked. Not about the bank trouble at first. They talked about other things, the way people do when they are relearning someone after a long absence. She told him about building the farm with Daniel, the first winter when the roof of the barn had collapsed under the snow, and they had repaired it themselves with help from their neighbors, the way the girls had come into the world and changed everything. She spoke of Daniel with a quietness that was different from grief. The grief was still there. You could hear it in the pauses, but it was the kind that has been lived with long enough to become something a person carries rather than something that carries them. George told her about the mountain, and he was surprised at how much there was to say once he started. The way the seasons changed up there, dramatic and total, nothing like the gradual softening of seasons in the valley. The year he had encountered a mountain lion on the trail 3 miles from his cabin, and they had regarded each other for what felt like a very long time before the lion decided George was not worth the trouble. The books he had read and reread until he nearly had them memorized. The silence which had been what he wanted and which had eventually become something he simply lived inside of rather than chose. "Were you lonely?" Maria asked. He considered the question honestly. "Yes," he said, "but I was of the opinion that I deserved to be." She frowned. "Why would you deserve to be lonely?" He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked out at the yard where the chickens were scratching in the dust in the late afternoon light. "That is a longer conversation than we need to have today," he said. She accepted that, because Maria Dawson was not a person who pushed where pushing was not wanted. But he saw in her expression that she filed the answer away, and he knew she would come back to it. She invited him to stay for supper, and he accepted, and they ate salt pork and beans and cornbread at the kitchen table with Lucy and Clara. And it was the first meal George had eaten in 7 years that he had not eaten alone. And the ordinary noise of it, Clara spilling her milk and Lucy arguing that she should be allowed to stay up later, and Maria's calm refusals to both of these things, felt like something he had not known he was starving for, until it was right in front of him. He rode back to town as the stars came out, and he sat on the edge of his bed in Mrs. Crow's boarding house for a long while, looking at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had built and maintained a life entirely by himself for 7 years, and he thought about what it might mean to stop doing that. Then he made a plan, because plans were what he was good at, and also because he needed to do something with the energy that had taken up residence inside his ribs, since the moment Maria Dawson had looked at him from that porch and said his name. The Bank of Copper Ridge was a two-story building on the main street, brick-faced and self-important in the way that banks in small towns tended to be. Lester Kane ran it the way a man runs a thing he has decided he owns by virtue of being larger than everything else around it. He was 50 years old, heavy in the middle, with a pink, clean-shaved face and small eyes that were always calculating. He had come to Copper Ridge from Denver 8 years ago with money behind him and had purchased the bank, the hotel, and 3 properties along the main street in his first year, which told you everything about the kind of man he was and the kind of plans he had. George went to see him the morning after his visit to Maria's farm. He dressed in the cleanest clothes he had, which were not impressive but were respectable, and he went into the bank at 9 in the morning and asked to speak with Kane. He was made to wait for 20 minutes, which was a power play and which George recognized as such and declined to be irritated by. When he was finally shown into Kane's office, he found a man sitting behind an enormous oak desk who looked at him with the mild contempt of someone who has decided the outcome of a meeting before it has begun. "George Townsend," Kane said. "I've been hearing that name since yesterday. You're the hermit who came down from the mountain." "I am not a hermit," George said pleasantly. "I'm a trapper and trader who prefers a rural location. There is a distinction." He sat down in the chair across from Kane without being invited to. "I am here regarding the Dawson property." "That is a bank matter," Kane said, "not a public one." "Mrs. Dawson has asked for my assistance," George said. This was a slight exaggeration of the truth, but he felt the situation warranted it. "I would like to see the loan document." Kane smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "I am under no obligation to show you anything." "That is correct," George said. "You are under no obligation to show me anything. And I am under no obligation to refrain from writing a letter to the Colorado Territorial Examiner, which, as you may know, has recently taken a significant interest in fraudulent land seizures in rural counties, describing in detail the particulars of this case and your role in it." Something moved behind Kane's small eyes. "That is a serious accusation." "I have not made an accusation," George said. "I have described a hypothetical action. There is a distinction." He let the silence sit for a moment. "I simply want to see the document. If it is legitimate, I will see that and I will report accordingly to Mrs. Dawson, and we will proceed appropriately. If you are confident in its legitimacy, you should have no objection." Kane studied him for a long moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and drew out a folder, and from the folder he produced a single sheet of paper and laid it on the desk between them. George leaned forward and studied it carefully. He had spent the previous evening with the documents from Maria's box, and Daniel Dawson's handwriting was fresh in his memory. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the loan document for a long time. It was close. Whoever had done it had made a genuine effort. But Daniel Dawson's capital D had a particular backward loop in its tail that was not present in the signature on Kane's document. The loop went the wrong way. It was small, but it was definitive, because handwriting was like a fingerprint. People repeated their particular errors and particular flourishes with perfect consistency, and forgers never quite caught the most idiosyncratic elements. George sat back. He kept his face entirely neutral. "Thank you," he said. "That is helpful." "You've had your look," Kane said, reclaiming the paper. "I trust we are done here." "For the moment," George said, stood up and left. He spent the next 2 days moving through Copper Ridge in a way that he had not originally planned, but which the situation seemed to require. He talked to people. This was not his natural inclination. 7 years of solitude had not made him a conversationalist. But he had grown up in this town before he left it, and he still knew how it worked. And more importantly, he knew that the currency of a small town was not money but reputation and trust, and that Lester Kane had been spending both for years without quite exhausting them yet. He went to the blacksmith, a big quiet man named Henry Torres, who had been shoeing horses in Copper Ridge for 15 years and knew everything that happened, because people talked in front of a man with a hammer like they talked in front of their furniture. Henry told him that he was not the first person to have a dispute with Kane over a property document, that there had been a homesteader 2 years back, named Carl Weiss, who had been pushed off his land under similar circumstances. Except Carl Weiss had not had anybody to help him, and had taken his family to Pueblo and started over. George went to the schoolteacher, a lean, precise woman named Miss Eleanor Hatch, who taught the children of Copper Ridge in the new schoolhouse he had noticed from the ridge. Eleanor Hatch turned out to be exactly the kind of person he needed. She was methodical, she was unimpressed by authority she had not personally validated, and she had a deep knowledge of Colorado territorial law because she had been involved in a school funding dispute 2 years earlier that had required her to read extensively. "The question," Eleanor Hatch said, sitting behind her desk after the school day was finished and her students had gone home, "is whether the circuit judge who comes through here is Albright or Crane. If it's Albright, Kane has him. Albright has been friendly to the bank's interests in 3 prior cases I know of. If it's Crane, you have a fighting chance because Crane is honest." "How do we find out which judge it is?" George asked. "The sheriff receives notice 2 weeks before." "You could ask him, except Roy Pickett would tell Kane before he told you." She thought for a moment, tapping her pencil on the desk. "But I have a cousin in the Pueblo court clerk's office. I can write to her today. We should have an answer within the week." "I would be grateful for that," George said. He also went to see the only man in Copper Ridge who had actual legal knowledge, which was not a lawyer but a former law clerk named William Sutherland, who now ran the town's small newspaper, the Copper Ridge Courier. William Sutherland was 45, wore spectacles, and had the permanently distracted air of a man who is always writing something in his head. But when George sat down with him in the back room of the newspaper office and laid out the case, William listened with sharp attention and said, "The key issue is whether the signature can be challenged in court. You need a document examiner or someone who can speak to the character of the signature in a way a judge will credit." "I can speak to it," George said. "I have seen enough of Daniel Dawson's handwriting to identify specific elements that are inconsistent with the signature on the loan document." "A mountain man's testimony against a banker's document," William said, not dismissively, but thoughtfully. "You need more than that. You need someone the judge will find credible." He paused. "The marriage certificate and the deed, both of those would have been registered with the Territorial Records Office. If the actual signatures are on file there and they differ from Kane's document in the specific way you're describing, a judge has to take that seriously." "Can the territorial records be requested?" George said. "I can file a request through the Courier," William said slowly. "A newspaper has standing to request public records. It would take 2 weeks, maybe less if I am specific." He looked at George over his spectacles. "You came down off that mountain for this?" "Yes," George said. William looked at him for another moment. "There are people in this town who will appreciate that," he said. And then, because William Sutherland was a man who noticed things for his newspaper, he added, "Maria Dawson in particular, I should think." George did not reply to that. He thanked William and left. He went back to the farm that evening. Maria came to the door when she heard Hester's hooves on the dirt road, and she stood on the porch with her arms crossed watching him come up to the gate with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "What have you been doing?" she asked when he came up the steps. "Working on your problem," he said. "I can see that. Half the town has come to tell me you were asking questions." She said it without reproach, but he heard the uncertainty in it. "Is that a difficulty?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It is not." She uncrossed her arms. "Come inside, the girls want to show you something." What they wanted to show him was a bird's nest that Clara had found fallen from the cottonwood tree, complete and still intact, a small perfect cup of woven grass and mud. Clara held it out to him in both hands with the solemnity of a person, presenting something of great value, which it was. He examined it with the seriousness it deserved, pointed out the different materials the bird had used, told them that the builder was almost certainly a meadowlark based on the construction style, and watched both girls listen with the total absorption of people for whom information about the world is still entirely new and wonderful. Maria stood in the kitchen doorway watching this, and George was aware of her watching, and he was aware that something in the quality of her watching had shifted from the wariness of the first day to something quieter and more open. He did not remark on it. He simply stayed with the girls until Maria called them to wash up for bed, and then he and Maria sat on the porch in the cooling evening air, and this time neither of them reached for the barrier of practical conversation first. "Tell me about the land," she said. "The mountain. What does it look like?" he told her. He had not talked about it to anyone before because there had been no one to talk to, and it surprised him how much there was to say once the door was open. He told her about the way the aspens turned gold in October, so bright it looked almost unreal, like someone had lit them from inside. He told her about the spring mornings when the entire mountain smelled of snowmelt and pine and something clean that had no name. He told her about the creek that ran past his cabin, the way it froze solid in January and opened up again in March, and the particular sound it made when it was moving fast in the spring thaw. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "It sounds like it was beautiful." "It was," he said. "It is. He stopped." "What?" she said. "I just think that beauty is harder to hold when there is no one to share it with," he said. It was more honest than he had intended to be, but the evening light in her presence had a way of loosening the careful management he usually applied to his own feelings. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard where the fireflies were beginning to appear in the long grass. "I know that feeling," she said softly. He looked at her profile in the fading light and thought about 7 years and all the ways that time could both wound a person and make them clearer about what they wanted. "Maria," he said. She turned to look at him. "I owe you an explanation for why I left," he said. "If you want it." She studied him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think I do want it." He took a breath and told her the truth, straightforwardly, because she deserved that. He told her that when Daniel had announced their engagement, he had realized that he had feelings for her that had been growing for a long time without his full acknowledgement, and that he had not trusted himself to stay and be a decent friend to either of them under those circumstances. And so he had done the only thing he could think of, which was to leave. He told her that he was not proud of it, that leaving had been a coward's solution to a problem that had probably had better ones, and that he had spent 7 years knowing that somewhere in the back of his mind. She listened to all of this without expression, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I was hurt when you left," she said finally. "Daniel was hurt. We both wondered what we had done." "You had not done anything," he said. "It was my problem, not yours." "I know that now," she said. "I understand it now." She paused. Are those feelings something that is still present for you? Or is this?" She gestured between them at the porch, at the circumstance of his return, in a way that might have indicated anything. George looked at her directly and said, "Why do you think I rode down from that mountain?" She held his gaze for a long moment, and then something in her face changed, softened, the way a door opens when someone finally finds the right key after a long time trying. "I see," she said quietly, and then after another pause, "It would be dishonest of me to pretend that I don't know what I feel either, George. I have been trying to figure out what I feel since the moment I saw you ride up to my gate." "And what is that?" he said. "Terrified," she said. And then with a small smile that reached all the way to those dark eyes, and relieved, and something else that I think needs more time than 1 week to name properly. "I have time," he said. "You have a mountain," she said. "The mountain will keep," he said. She looked at him and he could see her deciding something, could almost follow the process of it in her expression, the way she weighed things carefully and seriously and came to her conclusions honestly. And then she said, "Stay for now. Help me with this problem, and we will see what we see." "That is all I am asking," he said. He rode back to town in the full dark, with the stars blazing overhead the way they only blazed in Colorado at altitude, and he felt something he recognized belatedly as hope, which was a feeling he had not let himself have in a very long time. Eleanor Hatch's letter to her cousin in Pueblo came back with news that the circuit judge assigned to Copper Ridge this season was Judge Harold Crane, which was the best possible outcome. William Sutherland filed his records request to the territorial office in Denver on the same day. George went back to Henry Torres and asked whether any of the other tradespeople in town had had difficulties with Kane, and Henry said that the man who ran the feed store, a fellow named Archibald Quinn, had been fighting a disputed property line with Kane for 2 years. He went to see Archibald Quinn, who was a small, fierce man of about 50 with sun-darkened skin and a permanent expression of righteous indignation. Archibald Quinn had not won his dispute with Kane, but he had a very clear and detailed memory of every conversation he had ever had with Kane about it, and he told George everything he remembered with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for an audience. In the course of this telling, he mentioned that one of Kane's bank employees, a young man named Thomas Briggs who had left Copper Ridge 3 months ago for a job in Denver, had made a comment to Archibald once that had seemed odd at the time and seemed much less odd now. Thomas Briggs had said, while slightly drunk at the saloon, that the bank had paperwork on file that he did not believe had been created in the way it was supposed to have been created. George rode to Pueblo. He made the journey in a day and a half, pushing Hester only as hard as was decent, and he found Thomas Briggs working as a bookkeeper at a mercantile establishment on Pueblo's Main Street. Thomas Briggs was 24 years old and nervous in the way that young men are nervous when they have a conscience they have been uncomfortable with. George sat across from him at the small table in the back room that Thomas used as an office and said, "I am not here to cause you trouble. I am here because a woman named Maria Dawson is about to lose her farm and her home on the basis of a document I believe Lester Kane created without any honest foundation. If you know anything about that, I am asking you to tell me." Thomas Briggs was quiet for a long time, looking at his hands. "If I say something," he said, "I lose my good standing." "If you say nothing," George said, "a widow with 2 children loses her farm." Thomas looked up. "He had me copy signatures," he said finally, very quietly. "Kane. He used to have me copy signatures from account holders' documents, ostensibly for practice," he said, "for accuracy in the bank's records. I thought it was administrative. It was only later that I started to wonder whether he was actually using those exercises for something else." He paused. "I can tell you that I copied Daniel Dawson's signature on at least 2 occasions that I remember." George took a slow breath. "Would you be willing to put that in a written statement and sign it?" Thomas Briggs looked at him for a long, long moment. Then he said, "Yes, yes, I would." It took the rest of that day to draft the statement properly, with George doing the writing and Thomas reviewing and amending it carefully, making sure every word was accurate and that it said exactly what he could honestly say and nothing more. When it was done and Thomas had signed it, George shook his hand and rode back to Copper Ridge. He arrived back on the 3rd day, and he went to Maria's farm before he even went to the boarding house, and he rode up to her gate as the late afternoon sun was turning the dusk gold, and she came out to the porch when she heard him and stood there with her hand shading her eyes. "You were gone 3 days," she said, when he came up the steps. "Nobody knew where you were." "I went to Pueblo," he said. "I found Thomas Briggs." He told her what Thomas had said and what Thomas had signed. He watched her face as he told it, watched the tension that had been living in her jaw and her shoulders since he had met her begin to loosen, and when he finished she put both hands over her mouth for a moment and her eyes were bright. "You did that," she said. "You rode to Pueblo and back for you," he said simply. "Yes." She lowered her hands. "George," she said, and his name in her voice had a quality that it had not had before, something full and soft at the edges. "Come inside. I want to—" She stopped and started again. "Please come inside." He went inside. The girls were not home. They were next door at the neighbors, Maria explained. A farm wife named Ruth Hensley who watched them sometimes when Maria needed to get things done. The house was quiet in the late afternoon, and the kitchen smelled of bread that had been baked earlier, and there was a vase of wildflowers on the table that George had not noticed before. Maria poured him water from the pitcher and sat across from him at the table, and she said, "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead," he said. "Are you staying in Copper Ridge?" She held his gaze. "After this is settled, one way or another. Are you staying or are you going back to the mountain?" He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked around the kitchen at the familiar objects of a life being lived, the hanging cast iron pans, the braided rug, the curtains at the window with their small yellow pattern, and then he looked back at her face. "I would like to stay," he said, "if there is reason to." "There is reason to," she said very quietly. He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers where it rested on the tabletop, and she did not pull back. She turned her hand over and held his hand, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen with the late light coming through the yellow curtains, and it was the simplest and most complete feeling George Townsend had had in 7 years. He kissed her that evening. It happened on the porch, after the girls had come home and been fed and put to bed with their combined efforts. George reading aloud from a volume of Aesop's fables that sat on the shelf in the girls' room, because Lucy demanded it, and he found he was willing to be demanded upon. And after the night had settled fully around the farm and the stars were out and the creek could be heard faintly in the distance. She had been standing at the porch railing looking at the dark yard, and he had come to stand beside her, and for a moment they had just stood there together in the warm night air, close enough that their arms were almost touching. And then she had turned to look at him, and whatever she had been thinking was in her face, open and unhidden, and he had said her name once more and then kissed her, gently, the way you approach something you have been careful with for a long time. She kissed him back, and it was not tentative. It was warm and real and certain, the kind of kiss that has the weight of thought behind it, and when they pulled apart she was looking at him with those dark eyes that were no longer holding anything back. 7 years, she said softly. "I know," he said. "Do not ever do anything that's stupid again," she said. "I give you my absolute word," he said, and she laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the small polite version but the real one, and it was one of the finest sounds he had ever heard. The territorial records arrived from Denver 9 days before the circuit judge was due, delivered to William Sutherland at the Copper Ridge Courier by the postal rider. William opened the package in the back of his print room with George and Maria present, and spread the documents on the work table. Daniel Dawson's actual registered signatures, on file with the territory for the deed registration and the marriage certificate, were clear and clean. The capital D had its distinctive backward loop in the tail. The capital letters were formed in his particular, slightly angular style. They were nothing like the signature on Kane's loan document. William Sutherland looked at the 2 sets of documents side by side for a long moment, then looked at George over his spectacles. "This is enough," William said. "With Briggs's statement and these territorial records, this is enough for Judge Crane." Maria, who had been standing very still and very composed throughout the whole examination, put a hand on the work table as if to steady herself. George moved to stand beside her without thinking about it, and she leaned slightly into his arm, just slightly, but it was enough. "We are going to win," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. "I believe so," William said. "I am going to write the story for the Courier as well. Whatever happens in court, the public record is going to show what Lester Kane has been doing, and that matters." The day before Judge Crane arrived, the town of Copper Ridge had one of those evenings that happen sometimes in small communities, when enough people have decided that something is wrong, and that they are not going to pretend otherwise. Henry Torres came to George at the boarding house and told him that there were 12 families in town who had been affected in one way or another by Kane's business dealings, and that they were all planning to be present in the courtroom when the Dawson case was heard. "There is nothing official about it," Henry said. "We are just going to be there." "That matters," George said. "We know," Henry said. The hearing was held in the town hall, which served as the court when Judge Crane came through. Crane was 60 years old, with white hair and the unhurried manner of someone who has spent decades in courtrooms and is not surprised by anything he finds there anymore. He sat up at the front table with his clerk and called the proceedings into order with the same tone he would have used to ask for salt at the dinner table. Lester Kane was present with his lawyer, a man he had hired out of Denver who wore a suit that was too fine for Copper Ridge and looked at everyone in the room as if they were beneath him. Maria sat at the other table with William Sutherland beside her, who was not a lawyer but had legal training and had agreed to assist her in presenting her case. George sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind Maria, and behind him the hall was filled. The bank's case was presented first, and it was smooth and professional. The lawyer presented the loan document, spoke about the signed agreement, argued that the debt was valid and the property seizure was a routine legal process. Then William Sutherland stood up. He was not a dramatic man, William Sutherland. He was precise and methodical and quiet, which turned out to be exactly the right approach. He began by presenting Thomas Briggs's written statement, which the judge read in full and then read again, his expression unchanged but his attention clearly sharpened. He then presented the territorial records, pointing out the specific signature inconsistencies with the kind of patient clarity that you can only achieve when you have prepared something very thoroughly. He noted the backward loop in the tail of the D, showed it in 3 examples from the official records, showed its absence in the loan document. He did it simply and directly. Kane's lawyer objected several times, and Judge Crane overruled him on each occasion with the same unhurried certainty. Then William said, "Your Honor, I would also like to call George Townsend to speak." George stood and came forward, and he stated his name and his occupation and his connection to the case, and then he said, clearly and calmly, exactly what he had observed in the signature, the specific element that was inconsistent, the repeated pattern in the genuine documents, the absence of that pattern in the loan document. He spoke without exaggeration and without drama, and when Kane's lawyer attempted to suggest that he was biased on account of his personal relationship with Mrs. Dawson, Judge Crane stopped that line of questioning with a single sentence. "The witness has identified a physical characteristic of a handwriting sample," Crane said. "The physical characteristic either exists or it does not. That is not a matter of personal bias. Move on." Judge Crane ruled from the bench. He found the loan document to be fraudulent, declared the debt against the Dawson property invalid, and ordered it stricken from the record. He also recommended that the territorial attorney's office review the bank's other records for similar issues, a recommendation that George suspected would have considerable consequences for Lester Kane in the months to come. The room was very quiet when the ruling was delivered, and then it was not quiet at all. Maria sat perfectly still for a moment after Crane said the words, and then she put her hands over her face, and George leaned forward from his seat and put his hand on her shoulder, and he felt her exhale a long, deep exhalation of something that had been held for months. She turned around in her chair and looked at him, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "You did this. You did this," he said. "You kept those documents. You knew his handwriting. You refused to give up." "We did this," she said firmly, and she reached up and put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, and neither of them let go. Lester Kane left Copper Ridge by the end of the week, quietly and without announcement. Roy Pickett, the sheriff, resigned his position shortly afterward, and a decent man named James Aldridge took the job. William Sutherland wrote 4 issues of the Courier in a row about the matter, and by all accounts the territorial attorney's office took notice. In the weeks that followed, George did not go back to the mountain. He had known for some time that he was not going back, but there was a practical question about what that meant, And it was a question he and Maria discussed with the careful honesty that had characterized everything between them from the start. He had pelts and supplies at his mountain cabin, and he made the trip up once to collect them, taking Hester up the switchback trail for the last time as a regular route. He looked at the cabin as he packed it, the small, tight space that had been his whole world for 7 years, and he felt something for it that was not sorrow exactly, but was a kind of respect. It had kept him alive. It had kept him from doing something worse than leaving, though he had spent a long time wondering what exactly that worse thing would have been. He closed the door when he left and did not lock it, because a cabin in the mountains is a useful thing for any traveler who needs it, and there was something right about leaving it available. He sold the pelts in Copper Ridge and used the money to settle his account at the boarding house and purchase materials, because what he did then was build. Maria's barn needed a new roof, which he undertook first, recruiting Henry Torres and Archibald Quinn, who both turned up with tools and an enthusiasm for useful work that George found genuinely warming. The 3 men worked for 5 days on the barn roof, and when they finished it was the sturdiest roof in the county and would last 30 years. Maria came out at noon each day with food, and in the evenings they all sat on the porch, and George began to understand what it was to belong to a community again. He also built an addition to the farmhouse. He designed it himself, a proper room off the east side of the house, larger than what currently existed, with good proportions and a window that faced south for the light. He discussed it with Maria first, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, working out the dimensions together, and she made suggestions and he incorporated them, and the back and forth of it felt like something that had been going on between them for much longer than a few weeks. "Why that window size?" she asked, pointing to the east-facing window he had drawn. "For the morning light," he said. "If you wake up early, which I suspect you do." "I do," she said. "Then you want to see the light come up over the ridge. That window is the right size for it." She looked at the drawing for a moment. "You are going to a great deal of effort for a house that is not yours," she said. Not accusingly, she said it with a particular lightness that meant the opposite. "I am hoping," he said carefully, meeting her eyes, "that the situation might be amended in time." She held his gaze with those steady dark eyes. "I think that is a reasonable hope," she said. They were not hasty about it, because Maria had been through a great deal in the past year, and George understood that he was asking for the rest of her life, which was not a small thing, and both of them wanted to be certain in the way that people who have already made difficult choices once are certain. They wanted it to be right, but the certainty built itself naturally over those weeks, the way things build when the foundation is real. They were good together in the practical ways. They worked well alongside each other. They thought similarly about problems. They disagreed about some things in ways that were interesting rather than combative. Maria had opinions about most things and stated them without apology, which George found entirely appealing because he was the same way, and they had the occasional sharp exchange over something that was resolved within the hour because neither of them was interested in holding grudges. They were also, increasingly, good together in the ways that mattered differently. He kissed her in the kitchen while she was making supper one evening and the girls were in the yard, and she turned from the stove and kissed him back with her hands still floury from the bread she had been making. And then she laughed at herself for getting flour on his shirt, and he told her he did not care at all, and she looked at him with her eyes full of something that made his whole chest ache with how good it felt. Lucy, who was 9 and had the perceptiveness of a child who has been through difficult things and has been paying close attention to the adults around her ever since, told George one afternoon with great seriousness that she approved of him. "I am very glad to hear that," George said. "You make Mama less tired looking," Lucy said. "She still looks tired, but less. Before you came, her face was—" Lucy made a gesture with her hands that was difficult to describe but that George understood perfectly, the pinched, compressed expression of someone carrying too much alone. "Now it's different," she said. "Your mother is a remarkable person," George said. "I know," Lucy said, with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. "But it's good that you know it too." Clara, who was 6 and had been processing her father's death in the quiet internal way of young children, took a little longer to settle into comfort with George's presence, which he respected completely. He did not push. He was simply present, reliably and consistently, and he answered her questions when she had them and was quiet with her when she needed quiet. About 6 weeks after his arrival, she climbed into his lap while he was sitting on the porch reading, which she had not done before, and tucked herself under his arm and looked at the yard with the focused expression of a child attending to something important. He continued reading, one arm around her, and did not make any remark about it. He asked Maria to marry him on an October evening when the cottonwood was gold and dropping its leaves across the yard in a slow, spinning fall, and the mountains above the valley were the deep purple of late season. He had been thinking about how to ask, and had decided that the most honest approach was also the simplest one. He asked her without a ring because he did not have one, but he told her that he intended to correct that as soon as possible, and he told her what he felt with the same directness he had given her everything else. "You are the reason I came down from that mountain," he said. "And I want you to be the reason I never go back up for good. I want to build a life here with you, with your girls, with whatever else might come. I want all of it, Maria." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not unreadable, that was in fact entirely readable, and then she said, "Yes, George, yes." He found a ring at the jeweler's in Pueblo on his next trip there, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, not extravagant but real, and when he put it on her finger she looked at it for a long while without speaking, and then looked up at him with wet eyes. "It is exactly right," she said. They were married in November of 1878 in the Copper Ridge Church, on a bright cold day with ice crystals in the air, and the mountains white with early snow on their peaks. The whole town came, because the town had decided over the course of the previous 3 months that George Townsend was their own, and that Maria Dawson's situation had turned out as it should have, and that there was something worth celebrating in that. Henry Torres was there with his family, all 5 children, the youngest carried on his wife's hip. Eleanor Hatch sat in the third pew and cried without any visible embarrassment. William Sutherland took notes, which was his way of participating in significant events. Archibald Quinn sat in the front row and straightened his collar approximately 12 times before the ceremony began. Lucy stood up very straight as a witness, her dark hair brushed smooth, wearing a new dress that Mrs. Ruth Hensley had helped Maria make. Clara held flowers. She had asked to hold flowers, and she held them with both hands with absolute concentration, as if the success of the entire ceremony depended on her grip. George stood at the front of the church watching Maria come down the aisle on a cold November morning, and he felt the entire 7 years he had spent on that mountain compress into a single understanding, that he had gone up there because he did not know what to do with what he felt, and that coming down had been the only right answer he had ever had. She was wearing a dark blue dress that made her look like the mountains behind her, steady and clear and permanent. She was looking at him with eyes that were full of everything, all of it, the loss she had been through and the difficulty and the love that had been waiting to find its right shape, and she was also, quietly and in the corners, smiling. He took her hands at the front of the church and held them and did not let go. The ceremony was spoken by the minister, a young man named Reverend Cole who had come to Copper Ridge only the previous year, and had a way of making the familiar words feel like they meant something personal. George said his vows looking at Maria's face, and meant every syllable with a completeness that he had not known he was capable of. She said hers looking at his face, and the steadiness in her voice was the same steadiness she had brought to everything he had seen her do, the steadiness of a person who has decided something fully and is not afraid of it. After the ceremony, the town held a celebration at the hall, and there was music, A fiddle player named Pete Marsh who could make even a sad tune sound like an invitation. And there was food that half the town had contributed, and there was dancing on the wooden floor until well past dark. George danced with Maria twice and both times held her close, and both times she tucked her head against his shoulder with the ease of someone who has found the right place after a long search. He danced with Lucy, who was delighted and took it very seriously and counted the steps under her breath. He danced with Clara, who stood on his boots and let him carry her around the dance floor, which made her laugh in a way that filled the whole room. They went home that night to the farmhouse with its new addition, and the girls were settled into their beds by a thoroughly pleased Ruth Hensley who had agreed to stay with them. And George and Maria walked the last piece of the road to the farm gate in the cold, clear November air with the stars brilliant above them. And she tucked herself under his arm because it was cold and also because she wanted to, and he held her there, and they walked home like that. The first winter they spent together was the kind of winter that a man who has spent 7 winters alone remembers with particular gratitude. Not because it was easier, winters in Colorado being what they are, but because it was shared. The work of keeping the farm warm and fed and functional through the snow months was real and constant, and George threw himself into it with a thoroughness that was both his nature and his happiness, and Maria worked alongside him with the tireless competence she brought to everything. They read together in the evenings, which turned out to be something they both loved deeply and which they had not known about each other. Maria had a shelf of books, not many but well chosen, a history of the Roman Republic, a volume of poetry by Longfellow, a battered copy of Great Expectations, and George had brought his own books down from the mountain with him. And the combined shelf was the thing Lucy was most interested in, which pleased both of her parents considerably. They had disagreements, because real people in real situations have disagreements, and to pretend otherwise would be to describe something other than what they were. They disagreed once, significantly, about whether to sell a portion of the east pasture to cover a repair on the well casing, because George felt the sale was unnecessary given other options, and Maria felt it was the practical choice. They had a sharp exchange about it over 2 days, and then sat down together with the actual numbers on paper, and arrived at a third option that neither of them had thought of individually, which was to approach William Sutherland about a small loan to cover the repair and pay it back in installments from the spring trading. William agreed, the well was repaired, and neither of them mentioned the disagreement afterward except as an example they used when the girls quarreled with each other, which was that talking through a problem properly almost always produced a better outcome than holding your position for pride's sake. In the spring of 1879, the Territorial Attorney's Office completed its review of the Bank of Copper Ridge's records. The findings were, as George had suspected they would be, extensive. Lester Kane was formally charged with fraud in connection with 4 separate property documents, including the Dawson loan. He was tried in Pueblo, convicted on 2 of the 4 charges, and sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment. William Sutherland covered the entire proceeding in the Courier with a thoroughness that earned the paper wider circulation, and earned William a letter of commendation from the territorial governor. Archibald Quinn, whose property dispute with Kane was found to have involved another forged document, had his property line restored to its correct location. Carl Weiss, the homesteader who had been pushed off his land 2 years before, could not be located, which was a sorrow that the town carried as a reminder of what it had let go on too long without speaking up. George thought about Carl Weiss sometimes, not with guilt exactly, because he had not been there when it happened, but with the recognition that injustice operates in the space where people decide to look away, and that it had taken a direct threat to someone he loved to bring him back from his mountain. He hoped Carl Weiss had found good ground somewhere and was doing well. He hoped it honestly. That spring Maria told him she was expecting their first child, and she told him while they were walking together along the creek to the east of the farm where the willows were just beginning to bud. And she said it matter-of-factly, but with a light in her face that made the creek and the willows and the whole early morning feel lit up from within. George stopped walking. He looked at her. He felt something so large that he had no word for it immediately, and then the word arrived: grateful. He was grateful in a way that went all the way down. "Maria," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." He took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then her mouth, and she laughed against his lips. "You are happy," she said. "That is a significant understatement," he said. Their son was born in November of 1879, exactly 1 year after they were married, in the bed in the east room that George had built with the south-facing window. He was a big, healthy, furious baby who arrived in the world with an opinion about it. And Maria, who had done this twice before and was not alarmed by any of it, held him afterward with the same composed strength she brought to everything. George sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she put the baby into his arms, and the baby stopped being furious for a moment and looked up at George with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, and George looked back at him and thought about mountains and valleys and what it means to choose where you belong. They named him Daniel William Townsend. Daniel for Maria's first husband, because Lucy and Clara deserved to have their father's name still present in the family, because it was the right thing to do, and because George was not a man who was threatened by a history that had made the woman he loved who she was. William for William Sutherland, who had been a better friend to both of them than either of them had known to expect. William Sutherland, when told of the naming, removed his spectacles and cleaned them with great concentration for an unusual length of time, which was how everyone in Copper Ridge knew he was moved. Lucy and Clara met their brother with their respective personalities on full display. Lucy immediately began explaining to the baby the rules of the household, which George found both hilarious and entirely characteristic. Clara sat beside Maria on the bed for a long time, looking at the baby with the focused attention she brought to all important things, and then she said, "He looks like a potato." "All babies look like potatoes at first," George said. "Did I look like a potato?" Clara asked. "You looked like the finest potato I had ever seen," Maria said, and Clara accepted this as satisfactory. Life on the farm settled into the particular rhythm that a full, working life develops. Not easy, because the land and the animals and the weather and the children all had their demands, but deeply satisfying in the way that purposeful work with people you love is satisfying. George had the farm, and he also began trading again, because it was his skill and it was useful to the community, making the trip to Pueblo and back twice a year with hides and goods, bringing back supplies and news. He and Henry Torres built a small trading post on the edge of the Townsend property, which served the families on the eastern side of the valley who found the trip to town inconvenient. And this small enterprise grew steadily through the early 1880s until it employed 2 other men from town and was a recognized institution. In 1882, Maria gave birth to their second child together, a girl they named Rose, who arrived with considerably less fuss than her brother and immediately set about charming everyone in her vicinity. She had Maria's dark hair and George's gray eyes, and this combination proved so effective at getting what she wanted from her family that they had to conduct a frank discussion about consistency in household management when Rose was about 2 years old. Lucy, who was 14 by then and had begun to have the bearing of someone who would be a force in the world, took her role as eldest sibling with tremendous seriousness. She helped with Daniel's lessons, supervised Clara in the household tasks with a bossiness that Clara both resisted and secretly relied upon, and began to show a particular gift for arithmetic that Alina Hatch had noticed and reported to George and Maria with the excitement of a teacher who has found a student worth the full measure of her abilities. "You should think about secondary schooling for her," Alina said. "There is a good school in Pueblo for women now. She is more than capable. George and Maria discussed it and decided it was the right choice and began saving for it methodically. Lucy was informed of this plan and received it with the barely contained enthusiasm of someone who has wanted something so badly they have not allowed themselves to want it fully. Clara, at 12, had discovered that she had her father's talent for growing things, and the kitchen garden, which had always been good under Maria's care, became, under Clara's devoted management, one of the most productive small plots in the valley. She also had an emerging interest in horses, which George understood and supported, and by 13, she was one of the better riders in the county by any honest assessment. The Colorado mountains above Copper Ridge went through their seasons the way they always had: the green of summer, the gold of the aspens in fall, the white weight of winter, the extraordinary relief of spring, and George watched them from the farm and from the trading post and from the roads he traveled, and he was at peace with them in a way he had not been when he lived inside them. They were the backdrop now, not the whole picture. The whole picture was here, in the valley, with Maria and the children and the life they were building together. He went up to the mountain once, in the fall of 1883, taking Lucy with him to show her the cabin and the high meadows before the snow came. She was 15 and curious about everything, and she asked questions the entire way up the trail that George answered as completely as he could. "You lived up here for 7 years," she said when they arrived at the cabin. "Yes," he said. She looked at the cabin and then looked at the view, which from the ridge above the cabin was genuinely spectacular. The whole valley spread out below, the town a collection of small shapes, the farms like patches on a quilt, the creeks catching the light. "I understand why you came," she said. "It's beautiful." "It is," he said. "But I also understand why you came back," she said, with the directness of someone who has been listening carefully for years and has arrived at accurate conclusions. "Because you can see it from the valley too. You can see it from the farm. You don't have to live inside it to love it." George looked at her for a moment. She was wearing her dark hair in a braid down her back, and she was looking out at the view with an expression that was entirely her mother's, that particular combination of clear thought and deep feeling. "When did you get so wise?" he said. "I have always been wise," she said, with great dignity, and then ruined it by grinning. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood on the ridge together and looked at the valley, at the farm, at the small bright line of the creek in the afternoon light, at the smoke rising from the chimneys of Copper Ridge. And George thought that this was a thing he had not known to want when he was 25 and riding away from it all, that what he had wanted and not known was exactly this. The mountain still there, still beautiful, still present in his life, but not the only thing in it. In the winter of 1884, Maria and George sat together in the kitchen one evening after the children were in bed, drinking coffee by the stove. The farm was quiet around them, the good quiet of a house full of sleeping people, and outside the snow was coming down in that particular Colorado way, steady and deep, and transforming everything it touched. Maria had her feet tucked up on the chair beside her, and she was reading, and George was going over the trading post accounts, and they were not talking, which was one of the best things about the kind of comfort they had built. The silences were full rather than empty, populated with all the things that did not need to be said because they had already been said or because they were simply known. After a while Maria set down her book and looked at him across the table with an expression he recognized. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing bad," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She smiled at him, and it was the smile that still, after 5 years, had the same effect on him as it had the first time she had turned it on him fully, the smile that reached her eyes and made the whole room warmer. "About the fact that a very stubborn mountain man got on his horse 7 years after making a poor decision and rode down into a valley because he heard there was a woman in trouble, and that somehow this led to all of this." She gestured at the kitchen, at the house, at everything. It was not a poor decision to leave, George said, because he had thought about this carefully over the years. It was a poorly executed feeling. The decision to come back was the right one. It was the best one, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his. And outside, the snow continued to fall on the farm and the mountains and the town, on all of it together, the whole valley covered in the same white, patient, undiscriminating blanket. "Are you happy?" He asked. He asked it sometimes, not because he doubted the answer, but because he liked to hear her say it. "George," she said, "I am the most content I have ever been in my life. My children are healthy. My land is mine. My husband is sitting across from me at this table." She looked at him steadily. "I am very happy." "Good," he said. "So am I." He was. He was happy in the bone-deep way that comes to a person who has made the right choices and knows it, who has been honest with himself and with the people he loves, who has built something real in the world and can see it standing. Happy in the way that comes from understanding, after sufficient time and experience, that belonging is not a weakness but the whole point. In the spring of 1885, Lucy went to Pueblo for her schooling, and the morning she left was one of those mornings that marks the changing of a household as clearly as a new season. She embraced Clara, who managed not to cry until Lucy's back was turned. She kissed Daniel, who was 5 and only imperfectly understood why his sister was going away, but who presented her with a stone he had found at the creek as a going-away gift, which she accepted with complete solemnity and put in her pocket. She hugged Maria for a long time, and Maria held her and did not say anything because some moments do not need words added to them. She shook George's hand at the wagon very formally, and then reconsidered and hugged him instead, which surprised them both. "You will write," George said. "Every week," she said. And she did. The farm and the trading post and the town continued to grow and to change as the 1880s moved forward, as Colorado moved toward statehood and all the complexity that came with it, as the railroads pushed further west and the world came closer. George watched it all with the particular attention of a man who has spent time in stillness, and therefore notices motion with greater precision than most. He hired a young man named Will Bright at the trading post, who was 20 years old and quick and honest, and he taught him everything he knew about the business with the kind of patience that comes from understanding that the best thing you can do with knowledge is pass it forward. He built a proper fence along the eastern boundary of the farm, replacing the old one that had been leaning since before he arrived, and he built it to last, setting posts deep and stringing wire tight, and he did it in the summer heat with his shirt off, and Maria brought him water and watched him work with an expression she did not try to hide. And when he pointed this out, she told him she had a complete right to look at her own husband, and he agreed entirely. In the summer of 1886, a letter came from Lucy in Pueblo. It was longer than usual, and it had a quality about it that George recognized immediately, the particular careful phrasing of someone who is building toward important news. She was in love, she wrote. His name was Andrew Marsh, and he was a teacher at a school in Pueblo, 24 years old, and he was kind and serious and very funny when you got to know him, and she wanted them to meet him, and she thought perhaps he might be coming to Copper Ridge with her at Christmas if that was acceptable, and she hoped it was acceptable. George read this letter and looked at Maria, who was reading over his shoulder. "Marsh," Maria said. "Any relation to Pete Marsh, the fiddle player?" "Could be his nephew," George said. "Pete mentioned a nephew in Pueblo once." They both looked at the letter for another moment. "She is happy," Maria said. "She sounds happy," George confirmed. "Then he is welcome at Christmas," Maria said, and George nodded. Andrew Marsh came at Christmas and turned out to be a quiet, thoughtful young man with the mild exterior of a scholar and the hidden humor of someone who has observed the world carefully for a long time. He sat at their kitchen table and ate Maria's cooking and answered George's questions directly, and did not pretend to be unaware that he was being evaluated, which was a significant point in his favor. He talked to Daniel for an hour about horses and helped Clara with the evening milking without being asked, and told Lucy, when he did not know George could hear, that her family was exactly as she had described them and he was very glad to know them. George told Maria that evening that Andrew Marsh was acceptable. "I could see that," Maria said. "You smiled at him twice before dinner." "That is not a reliable indicator," George said. "For you it is," she said. By 1887, the Trading Post had expanded to a full general store, which made it something of a competitor to Frank Hurley's establishment in town. But Hurley had long since decided that George was not a man worth crossing, and they maintained a cordial professional relationship. The eastern side of the valley had grown enough that a second commercial establishment was warranted, and George ran his with a straightforwardness that built loyalty over time. Daniel, who was 7 by then, had decided that he wanted to be a mountain man when he grew up, because his father had been one, and he talked about this with the total conviction of a 7-year-old who has not yet encountered the concept of changing one's mind. George listened to these plans with great seriousness, and did not tell him that the days of pure mountain trapping were already changing as Colorado's population grew. There would be time for that conversation. For now, the boy's enthusiasm for the natural world was something worth tending carefully. Rose, at 4, was a force of personality in miniature who had very clear opinions about everything and communicated them with impressive directness. She was already friends with 3 children in the neighboring farms and ran those friendships with a diplomatic firmness that Maria found simultaneously amusing and slightly alarming. "She gets that from you," George told Maria. "She absolutely gets that from you," Maria said. "The diplomatic part, perhaps," he conceded. "The firmness," she said firmly. "Life was full and real and good. There were difficult seasons, as there are in any life. A hard winter in 1888 that tested the farm and the store. A period when Clara went through a quiet grief about her father that was triggered by finding a box of his things in the barn, and which required careful and patient tending from both George and Maria. A brief illness that frightened everyone when Daniel came down with a serious chest cold in the winter of 1889. But every difficulty was met together, which changed its nature completely. A thing that would break a person alone becomes, when carried by 2, simply something to be carried. George turned 40 in the fall of 1885. He did not make a great matter of it, but Maria made it a great matter by organizing a dinner that incorporated the whole of their immediate circle. Henry Torres and his family, Eleanor Hatch, William Sutherland, Archibald Quinn, the Hensleys from next door, and by the end of the evening, sitting at the long table they had built into the dining room of the expanded farmhouse, with the noise of conversation and children around him. George thought that 40 looked a great deal better than he had expected 25 to look. Maria sat at the other end of the table, talking to Eleanor Hatch about something that involved considerable animation on both their parts, and she looked up at some point and found George watching her across the length of the table, and smiled at him in the private way. She had not the social smile but the real one, the one for him. He smiled back. In 1890, Lucy married Andrew Marsh in the same Copper Ridge church where her mother and George had married 12 years before. The fiddle player at the wedding reception was Pete Marsh, Andrew's actual uncle, who had not lost any of his skill in the intervening years, and who seemed to view his nephew's wedding primarily as an opportunity to play as much music as possible. Clara, who was 21 by then, danced with a young rancher from the northern end of the valley who kept coming back to ask her again, which George noticed, and which Maria told him to mind his own business about, which he did mostly. Daniel, who was 10, ate an heroic quantity of cake, and had to be talked down from climbing the church's decorative elm tree, which George handled with the authoritative calm of a man who has been up many trees himself and knows exactly how that impulse feels. Rose, who was 8, was a flower girl of tremendous dignity, and afterward informed everyone that she had done it perfectly, and she expected them to remember that. George and Maria danced at their daughter's wedding, and it was not very different from dancing together at any other occasion, except that there was something in it that had the quality of a circle-completed Maria looking up at him on the floor of the same hall where they had danced years ago, with the same fiddle playing, the same stars outside, the same mountains dark against the Colorado sky. "Are you thinking about it?" she said, because she always knew when he was thinking about something significant. "About the last 12 years, he said. She considered, and I would do all of it again, he said, every single bit of it, including the 7 years on the mountain, because it made me who I was when I rode down, which was someone ready to stay." She rested her cheek briefly against his shoulder as they moved through the dance and said quietly against his coat, "You were ready the moment you rode through that gate. I knew it when I saw you." "You were frightened," he said. "I was frightened and I was ready," she said. "They are not mutually exclusive." He held her closer and they finished the dance, and the fiddle moved into something bright and quick. And across the room Lucy and Andrew were laughing at something, and Clara was being asked for another dance by the persistent Northern Valley rancher whose name, it turned out, was Thomas Reed, and Daniel was dancing with Rose by stepping on her feet, which she was objecting to loudly. George looked at all of it, at the lit room and the moving people, at his wife's hand in his, at the daughters and the son and the future reaching forward in all directions. And he thought of the cabin on the mountain, dark and still in the October night 700 feet above them. The door unlocked, the small hearth cold, the creek still running in the dark. He had been alone up there for 7 years, and he had understood things about solitude and about himself that he had needed to understand. He did not regret it entirely. But he understood, standing in this bright room with his wife in his arms and their children's voices in the air, that the most important thing he had learned in all those years of quiet was what silence sounds like when you are using it to wait for something you are afraid to want. He had stopped being afraid to want it. He had ridden down off the mountain and knocked on the door of his own life, and it had opened. Maria looked up at him. "Where did you go?" she said. "Nowhere," he said. "I am here. I am entirely here." "Good," she said. "Stay. Always," he said. "That is the only thing I know for certain." And the music played and the night went on, warm and full and real, in the valley below the mountains, in the town of Copper Ridge, Colorado, in the year 1890, in the life that George Townsend and Maria Dawson had built together from the simple and certain foundation of choosing to stay.